So welcome to tonight's third Budget Advisory Committee meeting. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to really look at the culmination of our time together, the last two meetings we've had, and for you all to review kind of a draft outline of what will be included and what we plan to propose for a budget stabilization plan and timeline to our board on November 5th. I want to emphasize that this is a draft. You'll see that there's a lot of to be determined. There's still, some conversations we're having, still meetings we're having with our management, but we definitely wanted to make sure that we captured the information that you all have discussed and shared with us over the past month and a half. Actually, I think it's just a month. Rose just sent you the draft timeline. We just finished it. And so you should have that in your email. We'll also have it up on the screen as we've done in the past. Okay. I am going to share my screen as I usually do and review a few items from our last meeting and kind of the outline of our time together. So just a reminder, this meeting is recorded, and we ask that you raise your digital hand if you have a question or comment. This is tonight's agenda. Always want to start with the district mission and a review of the purpose per our board policy for the Budget Advisory Committee. Brief review of our last meeting and really spend the heart of our time discussing the draft budget stabilization plan and timeline. So again, as we share at all of our meetings, our district's mission is to close the achievement gap by preparing all students for college and career readiness and success in a global society. Our Budget Advisory Committee duties per our board policy is to make recommendations regarding budget priorities, recommend cost reduction strategies, clarify or review the clarity and effectiveness of budget documents and communications, and when appropriate, present reports to the board. I'd like to take just a brief moment to review what we did at our last meeting. At our last meeting, we provided some good amount of information on our finances. And then at the end of the meeting, we asked you all to identify what areas within our budget you recommend that we focus on to stabilize our budget and potentially include in our budget stabilization plan. Here is a summary of how the polling went for the items that you, for lack of better words, voted on. As you can see at the very bottom of this slide, leasing property, professional development, advanced placement, and exams community day, those were of highest ranking for the Budget Advisory Committee and areas that you recommended that we focus our efforts on. You also had other areas, of course, that included employee concessions, consolidating positions, management positions, again, community day, updating job descriptions, et cetera, et cetera. Any questions about what we discussed at our last meeting? Yes, Julie.
Just explain a little more what the lease property is, like what the little more detail about that.
Sure. At our last meeting, we discussed if there was a potential to lease any of our property, of course, not to our competitors. We're not inviting in charter schools or any entity that would take our students away from us. Then we wanted to look at those opportunities. Should it be our, property over at CAJ? Could it be if we did make any changes to Main Prairie, could it be there? or just some other areas that we would be able to generate revenue.
Okay, so it's just a revenue generation, not a cut of anything. And
Correct. Yeah. Whenever we're looking at stabilizing a budget, I always recommend that we look at revenue generating, cost cutting measures.
And it's not, Brian, I know this has come up many times in the past, and someone asked me this just last week. It's not cost effective to consider selling the district office and the district office moving into one of those facilities, correct?
No.
Okay.
Market, yeah. There's so much commercial available in town still.
Right.
Yeah, that,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
yep.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
And selling those properties is not an option either, right? It's not viable.
You can, so if the main Prairie site would not generate really much in the way of revenue. It's not large enough and the location is such that it wouldn't be big bucks. If you were to look at, just give you an extreme example, let's say we decided that we didn't need or want the C.A. Jacobs campus area anymore, you can make a nice little infill housing project there, right? Good part of town, central location, those types of things. However, with 1,300 units going in the Southwest development area and more coming in other places, market even for that land right now would not be great. There is an
And what are our costs in terms of keeping that? Like other than property taxes, do we have maintenance costs for all these properties, or can they just sit there?
So first off, we don't pay property taxes.
Right. Because we're a school.
As public entity, we don't pay property taxes. So yeah, it's the costs associated with upkeep are all that we incur there, right? And those are smaller this year in some areas than others, but the lawns still have to get mowed, et cetera. So in grounds, you don't have as much. In purchasing materials, maintenance projects and things like that, we're seeing some decreases there.
Just asking, like, do we see us using those properties in the long run and are hanging on to it for a reason, or is there, I mean, what's the purpose of hanging on to it?
So I think we will use C.A. Jacobs in the future. You know, one of the things we've talked about is moving Alt-Ed over there, so they can have finally a full-service campus with a gym and a multi-purpose room and science classroom with running water and gas and all those types of things that they currently don't have. And even, you know, some concept there about even making it, you know, having some community classrooms as well. If the city of Dixon wanted to offer some things, if you wanted to have a meeting room available for Boys and Girl Scouts, you know, there's some options there to make it kind of a school and community center. And then do you look to get rid of Main Prairie? Teen Center would like to have a home. Might it be viable for them? Or is there other entities that would like to rent over there? The sale of Main Prairie is just, there's just not much that we would get there at this point in time. So we've not made a determination about what to do with C.A. Jacobs once we're all moved out of there. But what I can assure you is it will not sit empty for 11 or 12 years, as what happened with the old high school.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you. Any other questions about our last meeting? Nope. Okay. So at this time, I'd like to go straight to the document that was just shared with you right before this meeting. and it is the draft budget stabilization plan and implementation and timeline. I'll share my screen once more. I'd like to take a moment to review, of course, the structure of this document with you. There's not a lot of narrative. It's more of a summary of what you all have recommended for us, what internal conversations have included, and what information we have been able to gather since our last meeting together. How this document is broken up is, first we have information about potential cost savings. And then at the very end, we have information about what the next steps are, so a particular timeline. I'll begin with reviewing what we see as a timeline for budget reductions. And I'll ask that Brian and Nick and Cindy also pipe in to provide any clarification that the committee would like on these particular items. Okay. For 2021, we have it separated between ongoing expenses and one-time expenses. And I just want to let you know, when I look here, I have two screens. So if I'm looking away, I'm just looking at my other screen. But we have it separated from ongoing expenses and also one-time expenses. And I'll begin with reviewing those ongoing expenses. From the priorities that you all provided us, many of those priorities are just simply not able to be implemented this fiscal year. And so we identified which ones we believe that we may be able to implement this fiscal year. And they still need evaluation though. For example, we want to evaluate 5th grade camp, and the potential savings, we'll know that upon evaluation. We also believe that we could potentially evaluate professional development and may be able to identify potential savings. We also want to evaluate Saturday school and have potential savings. One thing we have also done is we have spoken to all of our management and let them know that they need to decrease their budgets of their unrestricted expenses. Remember, unrestricted expenses are those expenses that you can use for anything. Restricted has very specific criteria on how you can use those funds. So we've asked them to reduce their unrestricted expenses by 10%. And right now we project that potential savings would be about $482,000. So down here, this identifies what we project as of the information we have right now as the potential ongoing savings that we would be able to begin implementing for this fiscal year. Just a reminder, ongoing savings, just like the word says, goes into year after year after year. We don't plan to bring those expenses back into our budget. I also want to remind us that during our last meeting, we had a goal of reducing our expenses, ongoing expenses this year, of about $300,000. So we're able to meet that goal mainly through decreasing our department expenses by 10%. We're still meeting with each department manager and school site manager. And so this number may change. It may increase based upon the reductions that we've been able to recognize within our budget. And unfortunately, we may not be able to meet that goal, but we are going to strive towards the goal of $482,000. Okay. This next area here are one-time expense reductions that we believe we may be able to have in this year's budget. This isn't all-encompassing because those savings, more of them will most likely be recognized as we complete the first interim budget report. For example, you don't see utilities in here because we're still evaluating that right now. But what we looked at are the quote big and kind of obvious areas that we believe we would be able to decrease our expenses. The first is a soft hiring freeze. Cindy, can you explain to the committee what that would entail?
Yes, I would say soft or even temporary hiring freeze. So basically, we have vacant positions, some of them as far back as the beginning of the school year, some of them as recently. And depending on which positions become vacant, we would evaluate to determine if it's required or mandatory for us to have to staff those positions now. Obviously, if there's contract language, if it's mandated by law, we will have to fill those vacancies. But for those that we could consider holding off, especially now because we're in the distance learning mode, we are temporarily not filling them at this point in time, and potentially for the remainder of the year, depending on what that classification or position is.
Thank you, Cindy.
You're welcome.
The other one-time savings that we think that we would be able to recognize in this fiscal year is related to our bus contracts. We know right now we are not transporting students. And so we looked through our budget at the particular accounts for bus contracts, and we identified savings within those budgets. For example, in curriculum, we were able to identify about $5,600 in savings for that particular area. For athletics, we only reduced that budget for this year by half to about $20,000, $21,000. And that $20,000 is based upon our expenditures from last year. For busing for our Art and Design Academy at our high school, about $840. Band, about $9,200. Public Service Academy, about $880. We have not identified the savings for special education yet because we just really don't know where we're going to go with that particular program. We want to be as accurate as possible with that reduction. As I mentioned when I began explaining the one-time savings, when we're going through the first interim report, as we evaluate our actual expenditures and project what our annual expenditures will be, we'll be able to have a better assessment of what type of savings we may be able to recognize in the bus and transportation expenses related to our special education program. So for this year, we are projecting that a total of $700,173 could be potential savings for this fiscal year. $482,000 are ongoing expenses that we'll be able to take into next year, and about $217,000 would be the savings that we would have as one-time savings this year, but we know that we'll have to put that back into the budget for next year. Does anyone have any questions about the information I've shared thus far as it relates just to the 2021 school year? Kathleen.
Yeah, I think I just have two. So my first question is, Monique, I'm wondering if you could provide an example or like small examples of what the implications of a decrease in unrestricted expenses would have on a classroom teacher or a counselor or anything like that.
And I can try to touch on that one a little bit, Monique, if that's okay. So one example that is really prominent in my head right now, I think many of our heads, is one of the great benefits of this whole period of distance learning is the level of skills, knowledge, expertise amongst our teaching staff with using educational technology, the growth in our students because of this, and a whole bunch of newer, more efficient machines, right? So we shouldn't be buying nearly as much paper as we have over the years, because we're one-to-one. We're going to get, we'll continue to be one-to-one, and that will, while there's technology expenses, for sure, replacement machines, those types of things. The shorter term, what do we spend most of our site money on? It is things like paper is a huge percentage of it. So as much as possible, we're talking about things that are in that supply paper kind of elements. We talked about this in last year's meetings. Kathleen, you weren't on the group yet. We talked about really loose practices with regards to purchasing and inventorying materials, and there's a lot of waste and things like that. So part of the emphasis of we're going to have less money to spend, is also we need to spend our money more wisely. If I had to say the biggest thing that might impact teachers would be paper copies. And if Mark were here, he would tell you our elementary sites, as one example, about 1.5 million copies per year. Mind-bogglingly large number, right? 1.5 million copies. And so bringing that number down is one example of how teachers might be affected, but there is this, in that particular case, there's a balance with the use of tech.
Okay. And then quick, I guess, non sequitur. Monique, are we going to be able to provide additional recommendations for one-time reductions for this school year?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay.
What I'll do is after we finish with the draft template, I'll ask you, is there anything that's missing? What's missing from this draft right here? That can include one-time expenses. That could also include some ongoing expense reductions.
Okay. And then my next question was regarding utilities. I know that the objective of meeting was to try to create as robust a plan to present to the school board, I think sometime in November. But, pertaining to utilities, will there be at least an estimated amount of savings that our schools have had because of teachers choosing to work remotely? Will there be at least an estimated, savings provided for our school board by November?
As I shared at the beginning of our conversation, those types of savings will be included in the first interim report. We will not have any savings associated with our utility costs for the November 5th meeting. Something we are evaluating at this time, though.
I see you got a couple hands up, Monique. So Susie and then Kathy.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to ask a few questions about the soft hiring freeze. So what you mentioned, Monique, that some of these were relevant to distance learning, not needing them necessarily. Do we know on those hiring freezes, are they primarily classified or certified? And if so, for some of those positions, do we know how they're impacting others in their current work in terms of if like say, for example, I just think right off the top of my head, the grounds positions that weren't replaced, how is that impacting the other grounds people in trying to keep up with the workload if you're not, hiring? I'm just giving those two as an example that I know off the top of my head, but just curious about some of those hiring freezes and how they're impacting others.
I'll ask Cindy to respond to your question.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so there's a combination of positions that are vacant, whether it's certificated or classified. And again, given the current situation that we're in, a lot of these positions would be providing services when students are in person or on campus. The other question to answer in regards to just classified in general, not even specifically grounds or anything in regards to classification, but our goal is to work with our classified employees, especially those that are in person working and not with students, to kind of see if they're interested and willing to get some additional training to be able to take on various different tasks if they're comfortable with doing that. So it's allowing some flexibility with our current staff that's in person, that's currently working and on the books. Our goal was to minimize the impact to the extent possible to our current employees. And so our first look at were vacant positions first for purposes of the budget advisory.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kathy? Kathy, are you there?
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. This is a segue off of Kathleen's question about utilities. Is there any thought of, and would it make any difference savings-wise if we changed the settings on our utilities? For example, if our air conditioning went up 5 degrees and our heating went down 5 degrees, is that something that is even reasonable in terms of all of our buildings? Would it save money?
Yeah, it would save money, which those savings, in my experience, would be completely wiped out by the time and energy spent on addressing people's concerns, complaints, whatever you want to call them, about it being too hot or too cold. It's.
You know what my mother used to say to things like that, right?
I don't. I haven't met your mom. Please tell me.
She would say, "Suck it up."
Well, if as a president of DTA, you will tell your members to suck it up.
I don't know that they'll listen to me, but you know how that is.
I'm down with it, Kathy. I'm good. If you will take the lead on telling people suck it up, and I don't even have to find the politically correct way to say that. Yeah, it is a way to save. And you know, we set temperature set points 2 or maybe 3 years ago, and they weren't extreme by any. I mean, we did get some noise over those. So people don't have the same range of freedom that once upon a time they had, and that was as a cost containment strategy. But yeah, we could go warmer in the cool, you know, when you want cool air, and cooler when you want warm air. But I'll have you send that email.
Well, if you could get us numbers,
okay,
then we could work from that. I mean, it's not, you know, suck it up is not the right word, but you know, if the choice is to save some jobs versus turning the heat up, I think our members would be pretty open to that.
Good. We'll pursue. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Yeah, so since Kathy brought that up, this was what I was thinking the last time we met. I just want to advocate that we do not increase temperatures by 5 degrees or decrease, because we have health concerns. I had a student last year who had a disability where he couldn't, and he still can't, control his body temperature. So I'm sure that he's not the only student out there. But what I was thinking is, what if we were to regulate the time that those particular, you know, HVAC could be running? That, you know, maybe, for instance, heat and air conditioning are kicking in at 8 a.m. and they get turned off at 3:30 p.m., which are contractional hours. And so that way we're being very mindful about our energy use. And then if any, staff were to choose to work beyond their contract hours, then they at least have an understanding that, it might be a little bit warmer or a little bit colder. But many, many years ago, I worked in Woodland Joint Unified, and that is one of the ways that they try to be fiscally prudent is by not only controlling when we could access our thermostat, but they also had a campaign around like, all right, when you leave every day, and especially when you leave for the weekend, we're going to be coming in to check that your light switches are off, that unnecessary electronics are unplugged. And I think that might be an avenue that would be worth pursuing.
Yeah, thanks. And some of our units are programmed that way, and some of the older ones, we don't have that in place or to that extent, but it's a good suggestion.
Thank you. Any other questions about potential reductions for the 2020-21 school year? Okay, so moving on. So now we're going to look at the potential ongoing, expense reductions for next year. You'll see that there's a lot of to be determined. That's because many of these items here require absolute evaluation. We need to take things to our LCAP committee. It requires negotiation. And, they're just changes that we just are not able to implement this year. What we have identified, though, are some potential savings. For example, if we were to make changes to our advanced placement exam, we are looking at about $11,680 in potential savings. For consolidating positions, employee concessions, we're not able to estimate that at this particular time. If we were to evaluate elementary band, and if we were to decide not to continue that, at this time we're looking at about $23,000 worth of savings. The other items here, as you can see, are to be determined: evaluating management positions, evaluating moving Main Prairie to Dixon High School, evaluating the RTI program, evaluating summer school that's not related to our special education programs or our migrant students. That would be about a $21,000 savings. Any reduction in force, restructuring of community day, and updating job descriptions, those savings would be determined at a later date. Questions?
Can I just add something?
Absolutely.
Just for clarification, when you see the parenthetical notation to LCAP, what that's referring to is a lot of those positions or programs, et cetera, are spelled out through the LCAP process and will need to be, as they are, when we do the LCAP every year, evaluated and discussed through that. So that's just what that means.
Any questions about this information? Yes, Susie.
So quick question, I understand you can't put a number next to these items, but if I recall, just to kind of try to understand how much one may be in cost savings versus another one. For example, if you're talking about employee concessions, I believe maybe you would know exactly when it was, Brian, where in the last round of reductions, everyone took, well, at least I know it was certified, took some furlough days. They agreed to some furlough days. So, just to kind of have an idea of if everyone in the entire district were to take, 2 furlough days, what would that amount be? What would that even look like? Because it kind of might help you determine, well, it really isn't that much of a cost savings, or it's an enormous cost savings. So it makes it really hard to kind of know, and I know these are only just recommendations at this point,
Yeah.
but just curiosity.
Yeah, so I think a fairly standard framework for considering those types of things are just to talk about, well, what's 1% for each group, 1% of their salary costs. And with that, then you can do all the math around, okay, you know, we know that when we add 2 PD days to the teacher's calendar, certificated calendar, from 184 to 186, we know that's 1.1% of additional cost, right? So we're able to, if we know that the calendar, 2 days to the calendar is 1.1%, Monique can go in a quick minute and figure out, okay, 1.1% based on our adopted or projections or whatever comes to this amount. So it's then, you know, I think the common thing then is when you talk that, you talk, okay, is that going to come in fewer days in the calendar? Is that going to come in fewer hours in a day? Is that going to come out of benefit contribution? Is that, you know, there's kind of a menu of things that you can choose from. The way that most districts achieved furloughs back in the Great Recession time was they took advantage of the school year was able to be reduced to 175 days from its standard 180. So, you know, if you took 5 days out of 184 on the teacher side, you know, you figured that that was 2.6% reduction. Just as one example of the quick math. Just to clarify the history, we never got to concessions with either of our labor partners back in the Great Recession time. We talked about them. They were never implemented. The one group, and it was the year that Prop 30 was on the ballot, and if Prop 30 hadn't passed, we were going to see massive mid-year cuts across the state. And so Prop 30 passed in that year prior to Prop 30 passing, and for about 2 months afterwards, the management team had done a voluntary reduction of 3%. So that was the only actual employee concessions that happened back then. We didn't get to any kind of formal agreement on those. That made us, and honestly, that made us different in compared to a lot of districts. And it also led us to have to cut deeper into program, which, you know, we know program to the largest degree equals people. So I think, like I say, that starting point is usually, okay, what's 1%? What is our target figure? How can you get to 1% from the viable choices? Does that make sense? Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
Melissa.
Hi. I see. I remember when we already looked at moving Main Prairie to Dixon High School. But my question about that is, I know that the community day school cannot be at the high school. So
Right.
do we discontinue that, or do we have an obligation that we have to have some kind of program for students who have been expelled?
Good question. So there's really good question. The most of our students at community day school have not been expelled, and an even smaller number are there on a mandatory expulsion. So your mandatory expulsions are your weapons or your drug dealings or your sexual assaults, things that are rare here, thank goodness. So it's really only those students on a mandatory expulsion who have that requirement for an alternative placement. because you can, at any time, you can expel a student and suspend it and put them right back at their home school. And we've done that occasionally, but most of our kids, we separate from where their negative behaviors were and have them at the community day school for some time. So if most of our kids at community day school are there because of attendance or grades or just a lack of engagement or general challenging behaviors, we would absorb them into their current sites, or perhaps look at Main Prairie as an alternative sooner, to give them some additional support that wouldn't require the cost of a full-time teacher and a 6-hour paraprofessional. Solano County Office of Education has a program for expelled students that we could take advantage of, and it's already been something of a blended program. It's also the type of thing where you could reach an agreement with a neighboring district, like for us, that could be Vacaville or Travis, where for basically the cost of educating that student, we could have them attend down there. It's basically called a fee-for-service model, which is most common in special ed. So we believe that, and this includes Yvette Ramos, the principal of Alt Ed, that we could meet our the obligations we've got for students in the community day school and do a good job of providing services to them if it were closed. So
Can I have one more follow-up question?
heck yeah.
And how would we make it so we can, because I remember we had a bunch of money set aside for the Main Prairie move. And with that, maybe even came with doing an awning so they can eat lunch and all that. I'm assuming we do not have that money set aside anymore. So I think when you're evaluating that, you're going to have to also evaluate the cost that it would take to move them to see if it would be effective.
Exactly what we've been talking about here over the last couple of weeks while we've been going through this exercise of looking at everything. Yes, to move Main Prairie, it would cost us money to get things set up over there before. So yeah, I have my, just speaking as one individual, I have my doubts about savings associated with that. And we also went through the somewhat lengthy process of considering moving them there really for programmatic and equity reasons a couple years ago. And the resounding response from the Alt Ed community was they wanted their own separate space, even while it's substandard over there. So you're exactly right, Melissa. It might not save us money to do that.
And also, have you explored the possibility of moving them to the C.A. Jacobs campus and then doing something with their current campus?
Yes. Yep. We were talking about leases earlier, potential sale of property. That I don't believe the Main Prairie campus would get much in terms of revenue at all. We've talked a little bit about Teen Center and maybe them using it just to have a permanent place to go. But yeah, talked before you were able to join us about Alt Ed perhaps at the CA campus and community classrooms available, or meeting rooms over there as well. So yep, you got it.
All right, thank you. Lorraine.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Lorraine.
Hi. So I think maybe the last couple of questions touched upon the question I have, but in terms of these ongoing expense reductions, will there be, because it is over several number of years, a rubric for which these will kind of be evaluated since they are to be determined? And I ask that because I go back to, I think, some of the initial guiding questions that we had been posed, and one of them continues to kind of like stick in my mind in terms of long-term and kind of structural long-term changes that we can make to our budget and our operations. So with that, I'm just curious if that is part of this plan. Will there be a rubric that kind of accompanies each of these as they are evaluated? And if so, are they going to be put into pockets of, you know, one-time or reductions, as some of them are listed, versus versus longer term kind of systemic structural changes?
I want to make sure I understand your question, Lorraine. So if I can poke around
Yeah.
and make sure I've got it straight. I think I understand what you're talking about. So basically, we decide and implement. Here's 10 changes that we're making to save, and so that along with that we establish a timeline of some sorts to review those changes as to effectiveness, savings, need, possible return, budgeting for that return. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Well, to some sense, yeah, just because I know that, we had identified that some of these would they look good on paper at first glance, but once you delve down into their funding source, they may not necessarily be a big savings. So just making sure that we're taking into account those kind of specific areas and doing it equally across all of them. And that way we know, check the box, right?
Oh, right, yeah. And I think that Main Prairie example we just touched on is a perfect one. For that, you do the math of, we're going to have to spend X, and we wouldn't see a return on that expenditure for how many years or whatever. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and just having that accompanied, just for transparency's sake, if you're going to be keeping that in terms of a matrix of some kind, to be able to have that, at some point in public, that would be really helpful. Because I don't know how, this is going to be over the next several years. I'm guessing our committee is going to change over time. And that way the conversation stays fluid. The other thing I wanted to ask, the item of consolidation of schools, would that be the same as the consolidation potentially of grade levels?
No, they're kind of an apple and an orange, although they potentially could be combined, right? So the
I don't necessarily see that option on here, and I thought we had put it on, as part of our discussion previously.
Well, so within the consolidation of schools, you can look at that two ways. You can look at that as, that's a nice way of saying close the school. But it's also an opportunity for reconfiguration, right? So we don't foresee any cost savings involved in a reconfiguration now. So if we went TK1 at one site and 2-3 at another and 4-5 at the third, don't see cost savings necessarily, significant ones necessarily there. However, you can foresee cost savings more clearly with a school closure. They're not as big a bunch of dollars in a closure as you'd like to think you would get. You're talking about, if we went from 3 to 2 right now, you would save the expense of a principal, you would save some office staff expense, you would save, you save a little bit on custodial and food service, but you need the same number of teachers, you need the paraprofessionals to serve your students with disabilities. Your other support teachers are going to exist in the same numbers, close to, and you're going to have some utility savings as well. You're also going to spend money on moving and perhaps doing some physical work for the site. So again, that's that thing of having that balance sheet that you're, now that I understand really what you were saying, that balance sheet of, okay, you're going to save this, but what are the costs associated with that decision? So.
Well, I think that if consolidation of schools is different from reconfiguration of grade levels, that should at least be just looked at further. I don't know if it means, having, I don't know if all of this evaluation will happen in-house or if you'll use consultants for that, for some of those bigger items to see if they're really, worth squeezing any further, but just something to consider again, because this is going to be a multi-year conversation. And so that you don't continuously get those repeated questions, and that we actually do honestly and genuinely take a look at it as an option and know that, okay, we've done the research. We know that there is no savings there aside. And the reason I say this, Brian, is because I think what I've heard repeatedly is that, well, the community wouldn't necessarily like that. And I hope that we wouldn't not look at it because we may get some pushback.
Sure.
I think
yeah.
that structurally, if it's a long-term benefit for the students where they could keep the quality programs, where we're not having to, squeeze out things like AP placement support and things like that, because we can make some structural changes in the long term that people can eventually get used to as the community grows, then that's something we should evaluate. This is, if we're going through all this effort rather than expecting teachers and people to reduce the temperature by 5%.
Yeah.
Or 5 degrees,
Yeah.
I should say.
Right. And that consolidation, reconfiguring the grades issue, the board looked at that 2 years ago. To your point, that's 2 years ago, right? If circumstances changed, that we should reconsider that, So, yeah, point well made.
Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't see any other hands for the 2021, 22 items. And so I've moved on to the 2022, 23 ongoing expense reductions. When we're budgeting several years out, there's always a lot of guesswork that we try to make as accurate as possible, knowing that that situation will change. And so what our 2022, 23 financial situation will look like ultimately, we have a pretty good idea, but that may change significantly as we implement the savings for the previous year. But these are the ongoing expense reductions that we have identified that we want to evaluate for the 22-23 school year. For example, consolidating positions where applicable, we want to continue that conversation and that practice. At that time, we'll evaluate the continued need if we do continue something like this, employee concessions, evaluate consolidation of schools, evaluate a dual language school, evaluate management positions, a potential reduction in force, and update to job descriptions where applicable. What questions do you have about our 22-23 potential ongoing expense reductions and what we have listed here as items that we want to evaluate for that particular school year?
Julie's hand is up.
Hi, sorry.
No apologies.
Not a reduction, but as you're saying, 2022, 2023, and I know it's kind of a taboo word from some things in the past, but what about revenue generating from all the new houses coming to town? Are there any developer fees that are in the works? Because that was a huge amount of money at one point.
Yeah, we are seeing developer fees come in at a rate over the last year and a half probably that we have not seen in a long time. And they're going to continue as Southwest builds out fully and other developments that are being planned at this point come in. Developer fees cannot be used for as general fund dollars. They have to be related to school facilities and really kind of to growth or additional development of school facilities. So they're basically a restricted fund. The one thing that we have used them for that we had been for a time and not very much recently, we have our certificates of participation, which is facilities debt. It's non-voter approved facilities debt. And we have COPs, as they're known for short, that are still part of the cost of building Gretchen Higgins and part of the cost of building the new Dixon High School campus. So we have, at one point in time, we were paying half of those COP payments out of general fund and half out of developer fees. And more recently, we're paying almost all of it out of the developer fees to relieve any pressure on general fund. So you are making some shift there, using the developer fees to relieve a base or general fund expense, right? But you couldn't take developer fees, and let's say we didn't have COPs, we couldn't use developer fees for any other cost that we have right now. So the developer fees help alleviate facilities expense in the COPs, but we also need to try to hang on to developer fees for legitimate facilities needs that are going to continue to arise over time, right? If you spend all your developer fees on other kinds of things, then when you go to build something or modernize, expand something, perhaps you're in a bad place.
Okay, and then you see those two words, which actually are great, modernize and add on, or
yeah.
So if there is a potential expense and you're moving Main Prairie somewhere, that could be used for that.
If you can justify it to growth, right? So you really, that's the nexus, is you have to kind of be able to say you're tying it to growth.
Yeah.
And we haven't really had the challenge of doing that yet, but I imagine there are people who've worked in the field for a long time who have been very creative in tying developer fees to the growth when it might not be, you know, blatantly obvious at first look. But yeah.
And so many other districts are going to be experiencing the same thing. And I just wanted to kind of piggyback on Lorraine's comment too, that I would like definitely that to be looked at again about the consolidation of the, like we talked about. And it is an inconvenience, and I know that some parents wouldn't be happy about it, but as they keep saying, these are unprecedented times. And if that's what it takes to balance the budget and not go into receivership, that's a much harsher sentence, I would say. I was in all those meetings and we were this close to being there. And so if people have to, I'm sorry, you know, go to 2 schools to pick up kids rather than be in a situation like Vallejo.
Right. Yeah. Yes, Kathy Michaels will be out front telling people to suck it up.
I'll offer rides. I'll give rides to kids. Come on.
Yeah, thank you. Kathy's going to be stuck with me in that phrase for eternity. Thank you again, Ms. Michaels.
Well, you know what's going to happen is I'm going to be the one who's cut, so it doesn't matter. You only have a few years left. I'm at the bottom of the pile.
Oh, no, you're not, actually. Yeah, we've got some cushion below you, so you'll be fine. Yeah.
Susie.
Okay, I think this one, this question is a little bit twofold. It's about the consolidating positions, but it's also about a clarifying question that I have. I think we've talked a lot about some of the special ed costs, and I was talking earlier to a very wise gentleman today about this, and I also checked in with special ed on one of the spreadsheets that you showed us where we were spending $300,000 on a speech therapist. And so I was trying to understand, how could we be spending that much money on that position, because it named one person next to it. I'm not going to name the person, but it named one person next to that number. And I thought that's an enormous amount of money. But from my understanding, and what I'm trying to ask is that this person is contracted to us, right? So we're contracting out our speech services, right? And so my question is, how hard are we working to try to retain speech teachers in-house, where we would spend, I would imagine, far less money than that for our speech services for our students? They would still be receiving it, but you know, how maybe are we trying to recruit speech therapists out there for our district so we can reduce those costs of having to spend more money contracting these services out?
Sure. I'll do this first, Cindy, and then whatever you want to add on. Speech therapists, speech language pathologists, as they're called, fall in the same category as the unicorn, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and seeing some, pick whatever other kind of rare, the white whale, I don't know. The shortage of them is extreme. I don't know of a district that is able to fill all their positions internally. The majority of speech pathologists who come out of the programs now go to work for these agencies rather than school districts or hospitals, because hospitals is another place that has a demand for speech therapists with stroke victims and the like. So we're all stuck right now working with these agencies, and instead of having, we have one district employee left as a speech therapist, and that number has dwindled down over time that I've been here. So you're dealing with a position off the salary schedule. For a day of a speech therapist from one of these agencies, you're looking at least $750 a day, right? As opposed to what the daily cost of a certificated employee is. So, and that's a minimum of $750. We were just talking about numbers, and some of these are up around $850 depending on the agency. So, and it's not just with special ed. In some districts, it's special ed and it's math or science. People are paying signing bonuses, or they're getting a multiplier on their salary. We'll pay a special ed teacher 110% of salary to be able to recruit and retain them. So Kim is always beating the bushes. We constantly post for speech therapists. It's just really, really difficult to get them. Cindy, what do you want to add?
I would just add, in my former district, when I left, there were 34 FTEs vacant for that year that was trying to be filled. And in the course of forming a committee to talk strategy, to talk recruitment, and we worked with Sac State University as well in partnering with them to recruit, the problem lies with the interest in the candidates to enroll into the program. So when I worked with Sac State, they said they needed a minimum of 20 students to be enrolled into the program. The credential that they would come out with is a clinical rehabilitation services credential, which is a very unique credential for a very unique program that not even all universities even offer the courses to earn a credential in. Secondly, the program, once you finish, you come out with a master's degree as well. So the level of courses, the level of interest in order for universities to be able to even offer a cohort of students to go through the program to earn their credential is really where the difficulty is from the university's perspective. And then if there is a cohort of enough students for the university to even offer the credentialing program, once they obtain that, they tend to go work at hospitals, like Brian said, rehabilitation centers, and those kind of locations. So that's the piece I wanted to make sure people knew.
Thanks, Cindy.
Kathleen.
Hi. So I was wondering if it would behoove us as a committee and ultimately be advantageous for our school board if we could clarify some of the language in the descriptions of the ongoing expense reductions for the 22-23 school year. For example, when I see evaluate employee concessions, I know that we've talked about what that could potentially mean, but I'm wondering if perhaps we could try to narrow down a small number of concessions, or maybe tonight, I don't know, maybe recommend one particular type of concession.
I think the idea of some descriptors with some of these things that are less obvious or uncommon is a really good idea, Kathleen. And let's just say if we're talking employee concessions, I think we could just add the line, for example, furlough days, reduction in salary, reduced benefits, and that would help, I think, somebody picking this up really understand a lot better. I think that's a really good suggestion.
Thank you. Melissa?
Sorry, just one more comment about this, and then I will promise I'll be quiet. But
We don't want any of you to be quiet. Everybody stop apologizing. Knock it off.
I feel like as a board member, I'm here to listen to everyone else. And so that's what I try to do. But today I just have a couple of comments. So kind of back to the Main Prairie thing. And my question is, back to what Julie was touching on about the developer fees. I know we're super restricted and we need those developer fees for other things. However, if we took Main Prairie and consolidated the kind of school it is, and we added like it being a trade program where we are attracting more students, which I still think is an excellent idea, for one, to change the reputation of Main Prairie that it gets sometimes, to make it more attractive to other students. But if we change that and more students wanted to come, then could we justify that school growing and justifying doing other things to it?
You got it. You're on that kind of track, I think, of when I said there are creative ways that people could tie. That I think that's really kind of the kind of avenue that could prove fruitful.
And what kind of things have you guys, and you don't have to answer this right now, but have you explored to being able to increase that program, whether it is a trade program? I know a lot of trade places would come in and do, I think, some training in different classes for possibly for free if it's going to benefit them in the future.
Yeah, the labor groups out there have some interest. They in some fields they're having a hard time getting apprentices in for a variety of reasons, including drug testing as one of them. So yeah, I'd had some conversation actually just about 6 weeks before we went into shutdown with Taylor Builders, the developer, the master plan developer, and putting in of all the infrastructure, about some apprenticeship type programs. They had connections and wanted to, and of course we suspended the work on that as we closed, but I'm going to meet with them in November, and we're going to talk about that some more. So there are really good potential partners out there.
All right, thank you. The next part of our meeting, and we have about 45 minutes left, is really looking at the timeline. And many of the questions that we've had thus far, I think some can be answered through the timeline. We recognize that this is a multi-year plan, and some work will take time to complete. Will take conversations. It'll take time for us to evaluate what steps we want to take, and then determine what that final number will be. What this is here is on the screen is the potential timeline. There's a lot of repetition in here because we have the same budget reports and budget, I often call them quarterly reports. In schools, they're referred to as interim reports. We have those same deadlines on our regular budget, annual budget cycle. But what I wanted to make sure that we include in this particular timeline is the fact that we are planning to present information at the first interim budget, and that we also will include budget stabilization plan updates to the board on a regular basis. I also want to just take a quick moment to expand on our response to Lorraine's question. With the budget stabilization plan updates, and also just with our general communication about the budget stabilization plan, I believe it is our responsibility to identify our rationale for why we went with a particular reduction and why we didn't, so that people will understand. Also, so that we can make sure that information is memorialized. So we can be able to refer back to it in a few years when we say, didn't we talk about X, Y, and Z? This is the reason why we didn't implement it. And that information will be shared with our community, with the board, and with this advisory committee. On the budget stabilization plan, I just realized I failed to put in November 5th in there, the big deadline where we should go and share with the board. But in this timeline, our first major presentation and our first milestone is in December when we present our first interim financial report. The report will include the ongoing budget reductions that we'll be able to continue to identify and the one-time reductions that we are able to identify at that time for this year and the next year. In February is when Cindy will take resolutions to the board for reduction in force. In March is when we do our second interim financial report. At this time, we should have an idea on whether or not we will be able to implement some of the potential reductions and cost savings measures that we have planned for the following year. If the board approves a reduction in force, then we'll include the projected savings in our second interim report. Another important part about our second interim financial report is we will also include updated information from the governor about what he proposes will be the next year's budget. It's important to have this information because then we'll have an idea of what our revenues will be for the following year that will really help us to begin painting a picture of what the subsequent years will look like. At our second interim report, that's when we also plan to come back and make sure that we're giving the board an update on where we are at on the budget stabilization plan. Then in June, that's when we present our adopted budget for the next year to the board. At this time, we will be able to include any revisions to the governor's budget that will affect the next year's budget. We'll also provide an update to the board on the budget stabilization plan. Any questions about our timeline for this year? Yes, Kathleen?
So for the reduction in force resolutions, that means, just to clarify, that means that that is a resolution to lay people off, fire them. I don't know which is the most appropriate term to use, but that's for laying people off currently in the school year, correct? Or is that a resolution to lay people off for the subsequent school year?
Kathleen, it's Cindy. Resolutions that we take for this fiscal year would be effective the next school year because of the legal requirements in meeting the EDCO deadlines and then additional steps even after the board approves that we have to adhere to, including a final notice that would go out in May if nothing changes. And so given the EDCO requirements of the steps we have to take, it's a couple months of a process we go through. So it would not be effective the current year when the resolution is taken. Now that's for certificated because of the Ed Code requirements that we have to adhere to. There are different Ed Code requirements that we have to follow through for classified, certificated management and other groups of employees.
So then, again, just thinking about the presentation of this information and trying to make sure that it's as transparent as possible, can we maybe add that there are two separate, because when I look at this and I feel silly, I'm like, oh yeah, I see literally that it says reductions in force for 21-22, but hearing your explanation of that, Cindy, it sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that other than certificated staff, that there may be some staff in the school district that may be laid off prior to June of 2021?
You know, in my experience, we've not had to do that before. Now, that's not to say that the Ed Code doesn't allow us to, but we recognize the difficulties of doing mid-year layoffs. In my personal experience working in HR for over 13 years, well, 14 if I include Dixon now, I have never done mid-year layoffs. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there's not flexibility where the Ed Code does allow employers to. It's just, you know, that's not something that we want to entertain. And I have not implemented a mid-year layoff before.
Wasn't there, I feel like I was at a board meeting maybe early January, late December. Wasn't there a layoff of a classified staff member in the middle of the school year last year?
No, I've only taken the resolution once to the board last year in February, and it was effective for the next school year. Now that means they work up through June 30th because that's the current school year. And July 1 begins the new school year, the new fiscal year. So no, and in order for us to effectuate a layoff process, we would have to take the resolution to the board for review and approval.
Okay, great. Clarification.
You're welcome.
Any other questions about the 2020-21 timeline? Okay. I'm going to move on to 21-22, and it did go on to 2 pages, but that's okay. So in 2021-22, and Cindy just reiterated that our fiscal years, the school calendar year, begins July 1. So after we present the adopted budget to the board, if the enacted state budget, which is approved on or about July 1, has changes in it that would significantly affect our budget projections that we provided to the board in the adopted budget, we would do a 45-day revise. And what our district has decided to do is, even if those, if the enacted budget doesn't have a significant change, we will still take a budget update to the board in August, just to be able to make sure that we're providing them as accurate information and updated information as possible. That following September, we will provide an unaudited actuals financial report to the board. What will be important about this particular time point is that we will know exactly where we landed for the 2021 school year. As I've shared in the past, with the unaudited actuals, it will let us know what our ending fund balance is. And remember, we need to have a minimum of a 3% ending fund balance to meet our financial obligations. So what we learn at the unaudited actuals will be important information. Cindy, you have a question?
Yes, I'm sorry, Monique. I just wanted to follow up and answer one more thing from Kathleen's question. I think, Kathleen, what you were thinking was the resolution that was taken in July. And the resolution that we took in July was reserving the right to make 2020-21 employee compensation reductions. And at that time, that was based on what we knew from the May revise. And so that resolution was taken in July, but that is not layoff. It would be employee concessions.
Kathleen, did you have any other questions for Cindy?
No, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. And then next December, we'll take the first interim budget report, financial report to the board, another budget stabilization plan. So as you can see, many items will continue to repeat year after year. So in February, we'll have the reduction in force resolutions. We'll also provide an update to the board on the plan. March is when we have the second interim financial report, which would include any changes that we're making per any any changes to the state budget from the governor's January proposed budget, any expense reductions should the board approve any reductions in force. Throughout this time, I also want to reiterate that we as a budget advisory committee will be continuing to come together to work and evaluate what we need to do to stabilize our plan. I do anticipate, because it's just what happens, our budget situation will change throughout the years because the enacted budget will look different, the proposed budget will look different, the economy will change. And so we will have to make sure that we're coming back together and reevaluating our budget, our financial situation, and what changes we need to make within our district in order to be financially stable. This particular timeline in the 2021-22 school year is the same timeline that we would follow for the subsequent year. And so we'll continue, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing now. We will continue to have that budget cycle where we are updating the board on the budget stabilization plan. We will be including any updates to the budgets at the first interim and the second interim budget reports. We will be creating our adopted budgets based upon the financial information that's presented in the state budget. We'll also be coming back together as an advisory committee to have conversations about stabilizing our budget as the budget picture changes. And then, of course, internally within the district staff's communications with leadership and our frontline staff, our managers, we will be having conversations about how we can ensure that we have a balanced budget moving forward. What questions do you have about the timeline or the information that we've provided? I also want to ask, is there anything that you think is missing from the plan? I know Kathleen had mentioned that she had some suggestions for additional reductions. We're definitely open to continue hearing your suggestions.
I have a question.
Yes, Lauren.
Sorry, it was going to take me much longer to find the little hand on my phone.
Okay.
I am wondering if we could add to the parking lot list for just a longer term conversation, exploring the community partnerships that have come up a few times and maybe having a longer term vision for how those would be incorporated, not necessarily asking businesses to pick up anything that we're struggling to maintain ourselves, but maybe a conversation about what kinds of partnerships would be of interest to them, maybe along the lines of what Melissa had suggested in terms of trades, but on a broader scale related to our schools or maybe just specifically to our high school. I know that just being on some other committees, I think LCAP was one of them where that community engagement could actually, not only for the purpose of engagement with our surrounding businesses, but also maybe some long-term financial partnerships. And so the reason I'm being kind of careful about how I phrase this is that I don't want businesses to feel like, oh gosh, they're struggling for money, and so now here they're coming to us to bail them out. And that's not what I'm trying to suggest at all. I'm just thinking that in the long run, for some of those larger businesses like First Northern Bank that we've seen have regularly provided community support to some of our programs like sports, that if there were a broader interest in a specific area that they would like to sponsor in a longer term basis, that maybe we could have those conversations and start thinking about it a little bit more strategically.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's good. Other questions, suggestions that you want to share about the budget stabilization plan and timeline? Okay, let's talk about next steps. So we will absolutely take your feedback from this meeting, as we do with all of the other meetings, and incorporate that into the stabilization plan that we'll provide to the board on November 5th. After that time, of course, we will, if the board approves the stabilization plan, we'll move forward and incorporate those changes into the first interim financial report. For now, this is the last meeting of the Budget Advisory Committee for this calendar year. We will reconnect with you in January to begin setting up meetings for continued discussions about our budget and ensure that we are continuing to get input from you all on how we're moving forward. Okay. Brian, Nick, Cindy, is there anything that you would like to share with the committee before we end? Or
thank you for this portion of your work. It's not done, but there's a little bit of a break here. I think I would say we've got, I think a really big component of what we have to do next is communicate really well, really, really well. And just even, Kathleen, some of those suggestions about adding some descriptors in. We get stuck in our world, and most of you have been doing LCAP. Parents have been doing LCAP, and so the acronyms roll and the shorthand is used, and we've got a whole big audience out there who really don't know very much about this at all, and through no fault of their own. I continue to learn about budget and all this process. Ongoing, always. It never ends. So I guess I would encourage suggestions that you have about how we communicate out would really be welcome. Would really, really be welcome. And
don't use my terminology. Don't use my terminology, please.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any tattoos, Kathy, but I'd suggest on your palm, just suck it up, and then you can just hold it up like that. It would save a lot of energy speaking. How funny. I've done one budget update so far that went out, and they're long and detailed, and I fight this fight between needing to tell the whole story and trying to keep them readable. And I think sometimes I might be successful and other times I'm not. So, you've been here to help us kind of get some direction, but also any advice you have about how we communicate kind of where we are and what's coming. I'd really, really be interested in hearing that. So
I see Kathleen's hand up.
Yeah, I have a few recommendations actually around that, Brian. So I am a fan of the minutia. I don't mind getting into the weeds about things, but I do hear what you're saying, that sometimes, we as just people who try to support and disseminate information, it is a fine line of, how much is too much. So Brian, what if you were to create kind of like a Cliff Notes version of budget updates, but then provide a link, so kind of make a hyperdoc where people who do want to get into the weeds and read about the minutia, they could do so, but then you're still providing kind of, a shorthand of what we've talked about. And then my other recommendation, and I'm sure this is probably on the minds of several district admin in this committee, but are there thoughts or plans to provide surveys to certificated, classified parents, community members, other stakeholders around kind of what we've started to brainstorm in these last 3 meetings?
Yeah, that first point, I think I did that once several years ago, Kathleen. I thought it was a good idea, and I did it once, and then I haven't done it since. I still think it's a good idea. Sometimes, like when I send that Friday community update out to staff, and I will have some notes related sometimes to content, oftentimes to other things. So that, yeah, kind of that abstract or Cliff Notes idea with here's the full thing if you want to read it is a good idea. And we haven't really talked, honestly, we haven't really talked about surveying with regard to budget. And not that I'm opposed to it, but I think you have to do it, you know, like I was saying, you know, most people don't know very much about this. And so how do you frame, you know, that avenue for input in a way that people know enough, I guess, to have informed responses? I mean, if you gave me a survey right now about something with chemistry, even an introductory chemistry class, I would be whatever, no basis to know or no opinion or something like that for all of those. So, and not that this is, you know, people know what they want their schools to have. So it's not, that's not an exact comparison to make. But I think, yeah, we'll think about that. That's, surveys do two things. They get you some input, but they also communicate information out, right? So I can see value there for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie?
I won't say sorry. So
Thank you, Julie.
with regard to communication, as I had this conversation when my son was in 7th grade, which was a long time ago, with Mrs. Giramonti, we don't know what the silver bullet is. We talked about that in WASC today. We talked about it last week. Brian, you said it at the town hall. There were 70 people in that town hall meeting. That's all of secondary. It's pathetic, the number of people. And I don't mean to be snarky, but that's why when I say, like, if someone says, well, if you know, pick my kids up at 2 schools because you're going to do this, they're not here. They're not volunteering. They're not educating themselves. And I don't need to be your spokesperson either. Maybe I should stand by Kathy. And Kathy, I wrote you a note. You're not going anywhere. They need math teachers at the high school. So I guess I would ask, like, what your colleagues are doing in other districts to get the word out. You know, you have a board member whose wife is an assistant superintendent in Fairfield. I don't know how to reach people.
Yeah, and honestly, between COVID and enrollment and budget last year and the little bit of budget we've done this year, we're out communicating any district that I know of right now. Nobody is doing something like an update out every Friday, not even remotely close, and including districts that actually have communication staff or PIOs and that kind of thing. Now, that said, it's not enough or it's not effective enough, right? There's those components that.
Yeah, I don't know what but that did, I will say that again. I started off saying that today. The WASC, you know, findings were really good. And the one person that's the principal in Tracy, he was relaying to his wife. He told us in the parent group last night, he was relaying all the things about Dixon, and she said, when are we moving? So we have so much good stuff here that, yeah, I don't know. Thank you, everyone, for being here too.
No, Julie, thank you for being everywhere.
Thank you. Nick or Cindy, did you want to share anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to echo what Brian said and what Nick just simply said. I know right now can be trying times for everyone in different levels of, you know, and for different capacities of, you know, what everyone else is going through individually. And I know it took a lot of commitment and time on everyone's part to participate, volunteer, and contribute to this important topic and conversation. We find it very valuable. We find it very important. We find it very critical. So just a heartfelt thank you so much.
I thought of a couple other things I need to say real quickly. I know many of you attend board meetings regularly. please feel free. I really encourage you to pipe up during the budget stabilization plan conversation coming up, anything with first interim, any other time. I think your voice is there. I mean, Julie, I always appreciate it when there's something related to JKMS with a contract or something, and you just voice, I'm on the Citizens Oversight Committee and we reviewed these and da 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 da. It just brings credibility, I think, to what's happening there. So for any of you to speak up about process or direction, and please feel free to disagree with something that we've done out there as well. Yeah, if you're in the meetings and you feel inspired, put your hand up and say your piece. You know, and we're thanking you folks for your good work. And you know, and I know Monique would say, well, we're a team, and yes, we have collaborated around these meetings and such. But she's done really the best job I've ever seen out of a CBO in this district of putting information together and presenting in understandable ways. You know, like I say, this is year 23 here, and we've done lots of budget stuff over all that time. And this is just the most understandable, best structured way to work through this that I've seen. And I hope committee members that you've found this a useful, you know, some of you have been doing these meetings forever as well, but thanks, Monique, for all of your leadership on this one. Good job.
Okay. I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. Just knowing that we have such a good representation of our Dixon community, to be able to provide information and history about where we were in our district and where you think we should be going, and also making sure that we are asking those good questions about you know, why are we doing things this way? Have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? I truly appreciate what you all have done over these last 3 meetings. It has been very quick, very helpful, and very important to this particular process. Those of you who were here many years ago when we were in this particular situation, you know where we were and you know where we don't want to be. And I really do believe that we as a Dixon team will be able to stabilize our budget and be able to continue to support our students and provide those quality programs that we all want to provide to our kids. So please look forward to some meeting requests in January. And above all, please be sure to attend, if you're available, the board meeting on the budget stabilization plan. As Brian said, speak up. We all need to hear your voice. And absolutely, if you have an opinion, an idea that even we haven't discussed here, please share it, because we're really, truly a team, and we're all in this together to be able to support our district, to support our kids. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.